Hi, this is Aaron with Vanishing Cabinets, and in this video I am building a table for my kitchen nook, and this one I'm really trying to nail since my wife is going to be the main person using it. So keep watching and check out this build process. The centerpiece of this build is this beautiful piece of Padauk, which is this really red colored exotic wood, and I really liked the grain pattern on this particular board. Basically, I was picturing a table with this board being at the center and somehow have the rest of the table surface built around it. I got this idea from those really cool woven wood pattern cutting boards to incorporate a couple curvy strips with some lighter contrasting wood, really just to give the board a more interesting look and also to give my wife the impression that I was really being thoughtful here into making something unique. When it comes to gifts for my wife, it really doesn't matter how much it costs. All that really matters is how much suffering you had to endure to get it for her, and generally, more suffering equals more appreciation. To accomplish these cuts, I started by cutting out a basic template from some cardboard in the general shape of an arc, which I really just traced by hand, and I made the cuts on my newly bought Wen bandsaw, which did a pretty solid job. I ended up doing two opposing arc strips, which I added one at a time just to make the glue-ups easier. Some of those woven cutting boards are actually really intricate, and that was my initial aspiration, but after doing a couple initial cuts, I thought that was a bit above my pay grade, so I quit while I was ahead. This Padauk runs about $25 a board foot, so I definitely couldn't afford to scrap this piece, and overall I thought the look of the two arcs came out pretty decent. Once the glue dried, I got the boards cleaned up, first by scraping all the glue with a chisel, cutting off those excess strips, and then doing a couple shallow passes on the jointer and planer prior to any sanding. I tinkered with a few ideas for the rest of the table, but eventually I landed on having some boards surrounding this piece with mitered cuts, which I thought would give it a cool look. So once this board was done, I got to work on those white oak mitered boards. To cut the miters, I'm using my miter saw, and these boards are pretty wide, about 9 inches across, and this is where I ran into problems. I wouldn't realize this until later, but these cuts ended up being pretty bad, and by bad I mean that there were variations and waviness with the edges. And after doing some research, I found that this was mainly caused by blade deflection, which is where the blade is moving or deviating from its intended path during the cut. Apparently there are a lot of different factors that can contribute to this, but one change I'll definitely make is replacing this cheap thin kerf DeWalt blade that I had and getting something thicker and more high quality. Truthfully, I got overwhelmed when researching all the variables in saw blades like tooth count, the form of the tooth, the gullets, hook angles. I mean, seriously, I didn't do great in school, and this was definitely giving me some college finals flashbacks. But it's definitely part of the woodworking gig, so hopefully over time I'll get more familiar and absorb all the information. But like I said, at this point in the project, I didn't realize how bad those cuts were, so I went ahead with the assembly, and I'm using the domino joiner for the joinery. I ended up doing two separate glue-ups, the first one with those top and bottom pieces, and the second one with the left and right pieces. Alright. Is this the right way? I knew there would be some complications getting the dominoes lined up for this piece, which is why I drilled the mortises on the wide setting. But it turns out even with the wide holes, the alignment here was very tricky, so I had to fiddle with this a ton to get the boards in place. Wow, that seemed impossible. Eventually I ended up rotating the dominoes vertically in those wider holes, then once they slid into the opposing hole even a little bit, I pushed them back straight with a mallet and screwdriver. Once I had those pieces in place, I clamped it using pressure from my bench vise against some bench dogs on my work surface. Alright, so this is what those joints ended up looking like, and although my wife is very flattering when looking at my work, I suspect that even she would have a comment about how wide those gaps were, so I knew I needed a fix here. I landed on doing an inlay here to cover those joints. For the inlay wood, it seemed appropriate to continue with the Padauk theme, so I cut some small strips out and glued them in after rounding over the tops. The table thickness here is about 3/4 of an inch after I planed down all the boards, and if you are wondering why I am making a table out of such thin material, Well, I'm quickly learning that the salary of a woodworking YouTuber isn't quite what I had anticipated. I'll put it this way, even if I 10x my salary, I would still qualify for welfare, so 3/4 material it is until the genius of Vanishing Cabinets gets its due recognition, and you lucky few watching now can say that you were an OG Vanishing Cabinets fan, so you should feel lucky. For this table though, I did have one idea to make it look thicker than it actually is, so I got to work on that. Initially, I planned on just having the white oak and Padauk for the tabletop and calling it a day, but after seeing how sad and thin it looked, I decided to splurge and get a 6/4 board of walnut to add more body to this. I figured that if I added a thicker board around all the edges, it would give the appearance of the whole top having that same thickness, and I went with walnut to basically match some of the other colors in the room that this table would be in, and I thought that the darker wood colors would do a good job at framing the white oak and Padauk, effectively making them pop more. There was one slight complication with this walnut addition, and that was the shape of the space I was building the table for. This was going to sit in my kitchen, and specifically a bay window nook, and in a previous build I had added a bench and some planters, which turned out really great, but the only problem is that the planters are protruding further than the bench, and if the table was just a straight rectangle, it would make it pretty hard to get in and out of the bench without moving the table. What I ended up coming up with was shaping the long edges of the table to widen towards the middle and narrow towards the outside, which seems like a small detail, but it really does help a lot to get the table to fit the space better. Unfortunately, this walnut board had a pretty good sized bow in it, so I had to plane down a lot of it to get it as straight as I could, but ultimately there was still some warping, which ended up causing some complications later. I really should have milled the board prior to cutting out those curve shapes, which I think contributed to it running through the planer. But I don't know, I guess since my goal was to add more thickness to the table, I just buried my head in the sand and hoped that the bow wouldn't have been so bad after cutting it down, which it absolutely was. One issue with this glue up is I am now clamping up a workpiece with two different material thicknesses, and although I have the dominoes to keep everything lined up, ultimately the clamping pressure is going to be slightly uneven, and I did my best to combat this by flipping the piece face down to keep the pressure towards the top. Well, it's kind of a mixed bag, mainly a bag of S, but not for the first time in this project, I find myself with some shockingly bad glue lines. And while I'd like to say that I know the precise cause for all of it, the truth is that I can really only speculate that it's those issues I mentioned earlier. But the hope here is that in the future, if I make changes like having the same material thickness and straighter non-bowed materials, that the glue lines will come out cleaner. Yeah, I can't say I'm proud of this, but I had to do what I had to do and just go to town with the wood filler. For me, this is one of those areas where I have some good results and some not so great results, and I'm really trying to refine my technique. But again, this is mainly going to be my wife using this table, and her powers of observation are well, anyway, this isn't the worst project to have some small imperfections like this. I did have to go back and plane down the sideboards I glued on earlier to match the longer boards that I planed down in my thickness planer, which again was something I really should have done prior to doing all my cuts and shaping. The last step here that I thought would give this table a really sleek look was to add a pretty aggressive round over to the top and bottom ends, basically making like a bullnose edge. And I just used my palm router for this. I've had these 6x6s for at least 3 years. I finally have a use for them. Devil log!
Come on, you devil log!
I went back and forth on whether I wanted to make a base or just buy one because the metal bases these days can be pretty inexpensive on Amazon. But I really have had these 6x6 boards for at least a few years, and I thought they would look great for this project. These boards are construction grade lumber, so they were pretty rough around the edges. I had to take quite a bit of material off in the jointer and planer to get everything nice and square, but given that this is Douglas fir, the wood is pretty soft, so the machines were really eating through the material easily. I planned on having a stretcher between the two 6x6s, and I had some white oak still that I thought would look great to match the top, and I thought it would look even better and more stable to have these stretchers sitting in a notch across the middle. So I got to work on these first by using my track saw, but after realizing that it would take weeks to do, I switched over to my dado blade, which made light work of these notches. I also cut a rabbet along the bottom edge of each leg that would basically create a tenon that would go into a mortise that I would eventually make for the table feet. I planned on staining this black, so the main goal of all this cleanup work was really just to get a nice flat surface to stain, but there was one troublesome corner that was going to take a bit more than sanding to fix. Guess we lost power. With the legs all stained and looking good, I got to work on the feet, and I started by cutting out a square that the leg tenon would slide into, and then I glued a second board on the bottom, really just to add some thickness and rigidity. To make the feet a little more interesting, I added a 20-degree bevel around all the sides. With the feet cut, I went ahead and attached them to the bottom of the legs by sliding a square peg into a square hole. And I was pretty happy with the general look of these legs, but for those viewers out there smarter than me, you probably can see the issue with these. But at this point, I was blissfully unaware, so I continued on building the white oak stretcher that would sit in the notches I cut out earlier. My goal with the stretcher build here was to make it look like one big piece of wood connecting the two legs, so essentially I made a box beam with some mitered cuts to complete the look wrapping around the legs. Again, I used white oak to keep the color theme across the whole table, and this is sneakily one of my favorite parts of the whole build. I suppose I like it because I really didn't have to try and over-engineer anything. I just had a rough plan in mind, made some measurements and some cuts, and really just built this thing on autopilot now, having built enough things similar to where I didn't have to think about it too much. So when it actually came out looking like one piece of wood, which is what I initially wanted it to look like, I dared to have the fleeting thought, hey, maybe I am getting better at this whole woodworking thing, and maybe I won't be a hack forever. I chose to finish the base with some semi-gloss spray lacquer, mainly because I wanted something that was going to be more durable, and after adding 3 coats to that, I got started on finishing the top. After finishing the top with some Rubio Monocoat, which is a penetrating oil finish, I attached the base to the top using a couple steel plates I got from Amazon, and I'm also using a small strip of plywood as a spacer board here because I don't have any screws short enough to not poke through that really thin top. One benefit of a thin top is that the table is really light and easy to move, so it's finally time to get this thing moved to its final home. Almost. Alright, take 2. I got some more appropriately sized feet on here, and now it's finally time for the big reveal.
Oh, babe! This looks amazing! You don't like the legs? These flowers are beautiful! Where did you get them?
You know.
I love it.
I need to. Alright folks, that's going to do it for this one, but I did want to quickly mention that I came back later and added a couple coats of the N3 Nano hard coat and top coat for these final shots here, so it has more sheen than it would with just the Rubio. But anyways, thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I will see you on the next one.